The wind arrives before the cold truly registers. It moves across the frozen sea in waves, not gusting but constant, a pressure against every exposed surface that strips warmth from living tissue in seconds. The temperature hovers at 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, a figure so extreme that unprotected skin begins to freeze in under a minute. The sea ice stretches to the horizon in every direction, a fractured plain of white and gray and deep blue-black where pressure ridges have forced massive slabs upward at violent angles. There is no tree line visible. There is no smoke rising from distant camps. There is only the ice, the wind, the endless grinding of frozen plates against one another, and the thin gray light of an Arctic winter that barely qualifies as day. In these conditions, the human body becomes a failing system almost immediately. Core temperature drops. Blood retreats from the extremities to protect vital organs. Fingers lose dexterity. Judgment deteriorates. Without intervention, unconsciousness follows within an hour, and death shortly after. This is not speculation, and yet people lived here. Not merely passed through, but established permanent populations along coastlines where temperatures regularly plunged to these extremes. They hunted on the sea ice. They traveled across it for days at a time. They gave birth, raised children, grew old, and died of natural causes in environments that should have killed them within their first hour of exposure. This is not legend. The archaeological record is unambiguous. Stone tools recovered from ancient coastal sites in the high Arctic, some dating back thousands of years, confirm continuous human presence in regions where the cold routinely reached levels that would be lethal to any modern person caught without technological support. The question is not whether ancient people survived these conditions. The evidence confirms that they did. The question is how. The most common assumption involves fire. Popular imagination places our ancestors huddled around flames, warming themselves through the endless polar night, cooking their food, drying their clothes, and creating islands of heat in the frozen world. This image is comforting. It is also, in many cases, fundamentally wrong. Fire requires fuel. In the Arctic maritime environment, fuel was extraordinarily scarce. There were no forests on the sea ice. Driftwood, when available, was precious and reserved for essential purposes that could not be achieved any other way. The idea that ancient Arctic peoples maintained constant fires is not supported by what we know of their actual circumstances. More importantly, fire on sea ice was dangerous. Open flame could weaken the ice surface. It created steam and moisture that would freeze on clothing and shelter materials, destroying their insulating properties. In high winds, maintaining a fire was impractical or impossible. What archaeological and ethnographic evidence actually reveals is something far more interesting. Ancient peoples of the Arctic maritime world developed sophisticated systems of thermal management that did not depend on fire as a primary heat source. They understood, at a level that suggests generations of refined knowledge, exactly how the human body loses heat and precisely which interventions could slow or stop that loss. Heat leaves the body through 4 primary mechanisms: conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact with cold surfaces. Convection is heat stripped away by moving air or water. Radiation is heat lost to the surrounding environment when the body is warmer than its surroundings. Evaporation is heat lost when moisture on or near the skin transforms from liquid to gas. Each of these mechanisms was understood, perhaps not in these exact terms, but in practical application, by people who had to manage them constantly or die. The most critical factor in extreme cold survival is wind. Moving air accelerates heat loss far beyond what still air at the same temperature would cause. At -50 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind of even 15 miles per hour, exposed skin will freeze solid in less than 5 minutes. The wind chill effect, as we now call it, was something ancient Arctic peoples knew intimately. Their entire approach to survival on the sea ice began with wind management. When traveling or hunting on the ice, they used the landscape itself as protection. Pressure ridges, those jagged walls of ice forced upward by the shifting plates beneath, created natural windbreaks. By positioning themselves in the lee of these formations, they could reduce effective wind exposure by 80% or more. This was not accidental. Ethnographic accounts from the 19th and early 20th centuries describe Arctic hunters spending considerable time and energy locating appropriate pressure ridges before stopping to rest, even when exhaustion might have urged them to halt immediately. When natural windbreaks were unavailable, they created artificial ones. Snow blocks cut from the surface could be stacked quickly into low walls that deflected wind at ground level. These were not shelters in the conventional sense. They had no roofs, no doors, no interior space meant to be heated. They were simply barriers positioned to create a zone of relatively still air in which the human body could retain heat more effectively. The clothing systems developed by Arctic maritime peoples represent some of the most sophisticated thermal engineering in human history. Modern understanding of insulation confirms what these ancient designers discovered through experience and refinement over countless generations. Dead air trapped in small pockets provides exceptional resistance to heat transfer. The key is creating and maintaining those air pockets while preventing moisture from accumulating and destroying the insulating effect. Garments were constructed in layers, with the innermost layer designed to trap air against the skin, while wicking away any moisture produced by the body. This was achieved using specific preparations of animal skins. The hide was scraped and worked until it achieved the proper flexibility while retaining the hair or fur that would create the insulating layer. Different animals provided different properties. Some furs excelled at moisture management. Others provided maximum loft and air-trapping capacity. The selection and combination of materials was not arbitrary but reflected precise knowledge of how each would perform under specific conditions. The outer layer served a different purpose entirely. It was designed as a barrier against wind and water, preventing the convective stripping of heat from the insulating layers beneath. This outer shell was often made from materials that modern observers might not immediately recognize as appropriate for cold weather. Gut, the intestinal lining of marine mammals, was processed into thin, flexible sheets that could be sewn together to create waterproof and windproof outer garments. These gut parkas, documented extensively among historical Arctic peoples, were remarkably effective at blocking the wind, while remaining light enough not to impede movement during the physically demanding work of traveling and hunting on the ice. The system only worked, however, if moisture was carefully managed. Sweat generated by physical exertion would migrate outward through the insulating layers, and in extreme cold, it would freeze before reaching the outer shell. Ice accumulation within the garments would destroy their insulating properties and could be fatal. Arctic peoples managed this by modulating their activity levels to prevent excessive sweating, by venting their garments periodically to allow moisture to escape, and by carefully drying their clothing whenever conditions permitted. The use of animal fats represented another critical technology. Fat applied to the skin provided a layer of resistance against moisture accumulation and offered some protection against the initial shock of cold contact. It also allowed the skin to maintain flexibility in temperatures that would otherwise cause cracking and damage. Archaeological sites have yielded evidence of fat processing facilities at remarkable antiquity, and the practice of applying rendered fat to exposed skin areas is documented among virtually all historical Arctic peoples. Beyond personal application, fat served as a critical component of emergency heat production. Small containers of rendered blubber could be ignited to provide brief, focused heat when absolutely necessary, such as preventing frostbite in exposed extremities or providing enough warmth to restore function to hands that had lost dexterity. This was not a campfire. It was a controlled, minimal heat source used precisely and sparingly, extinguished as soon as its specific purpose was achieved. Shelter, when constructed on the sea ice, took forms quite different from what most people imagine. The iconic snow house, the igloo, was indeed used by some Arctic coastal peoples, but it was only one option among many, and was not universally employed. Its construction required specific snow conditions that were not always present, and it required time and energy that might not be available. More common for temporary shelter on the ice was a simple modification of the environment. A depression was created in the snow, either by digging or by locating a natural hollow. This depression placed the occupant below the level of the surrounding surface, providing immediate wind protection. Snow blocks or loose snow piled around the rim of the depression further increased the windbreak effect. A covering of some kind, sometimes a skin tent panel, sometimes simply additional loose snow, could be arranged to block direct exposure to the sky, preventing radiative heat loss to the cold atmosphere above. These were not warm spaces. The interior temperature of such a shelter might be only a few degrees above the exterior temperature, still profoundly cold by any ordinary standard. But the absence of wind changed everything. A human body properly clothed, positioned in still air rather than moving wind, could maintain core temperature for extended periods, even in temperatures far below zero. The occupants of such shelters typically arranged themselves in specific positions to maximize heat retention. Knees drawn toward the chest reduced the surface area exposed to cold air. Hands were tucked into armpits or groin regions where major blood vessels ran close to the surface. Multiple people in close physical contact shared body heat directly, each person's thermal output contributing to the warmth of the others. This was not merely social behavior. It was essential survival technique, and groups traveling on the ice organized themselves according to thermal logic as much as social relationship. Ethnographic records describe sleeping arrangements in which the most vulnerable individuals were placed in the warmest positions, often between adults who remained awake in shifts to monitor conditions and ensure that no one's extremities were becoming dangerously cold. This constant vigilance, maintained through entire nights of darkness and cold, required discipline and coordination that speaks to deeply embedded cultural practices oriented toward collective survival. The psychological dimension of survival in these conditions deserves serious consideration. Modern research on cold weather survival consistently identifies psychological factors as critical determinants of outcome. Panic accelerates heat loss by triggering physiological responses that push blood toward the extremities. Poor decision-making leads to fatal errors. Despair reduces the will to perform the constant small actions required to maintain life in extreme environments. The wind continues across the frozen sea. The temperature remains at levels that would kill any unprepared person within the hour. But somewhere on that ice, thousands of years ago, a group of human beings settled into the lee of a pressure ridge, arranged their bodies in configurations that maximized shared warmth, checked their garments for ice accumulation, monitored one another for signs of cold injury, and waited for conditions that would allow them to continue their journey. They were not surviving despite the cold. They were living within it, using knowledge and discipline and carefully developed technology to occupy an environment that should have been impossible for beings like themselves. They did not struggle against the Arctic. They understood it, respected it, and operated within its constraints with a skill that allowed their children to be born and their elders to die of old age in places where modern humans cannot last an unprotected hour. This is not a story of hardship endured. It is a story of intelligence applied, of problems solved, of human capability expressed at its highest level. The frozen sea killed everything that did not belong there. These people belonged there, because they had earned the right to belong through generations of learning and teaching and refining and perfecting the art of being warm enough to live when everything in the universe was trying to make them cold enough to die. They succeeded. The fact that anyone lives in the Arctic today, the unbroken thread of occupation stretching back into deep time, is proof of their success. It is a reminder that our ancestors were not less capable than ourselves. They were, in their own domains and with their own tools, as brilliant and determined and ingenious as any engineers who have ever lived. The frozen seas tested them absolutely, and they passed.